300 guests watched a bride in a $5 million gown strike a kneeling maid across the face, and not one of them said a word. What none of them knew, not the bride, not the groom, not a single person holding a champagne flute in that glittering ballroom, was that the woman on her knees had been placed there deliberately, and that within 3 weeks, the truth about who she actually was would end one engagement and quietly rewrite the future of an entire family fortune. Welcome back. Before we start, tell me where you're watching from tonight. I read every comment, and I promise you this story is not going where you think it's going. Stay until the end, because what this maid turns out to be will completely change how you see the moment that slap landed. Nobody in Newport had seen a wedding quite like this one. The Ash Grove estate sat perched above the Rhode Island coastline, its lawns rolling down toward the water in terraces lined with white orchids flown in from 3 continents, a live orchestra tucked beneath a restored glass conservatory, ceiling that had taken 11 months and considerable expense to renovate specifically for this event. At the center of it stood Nathaniel Voss, 34 years old, heir to Voss Maritime Holdings, one of the oldest shipping and logistics fortunes on the eastern seaboard. He was the kind of groom society columns loved to describe as unexpectedly grounded for a man of his wealth, careful, deliberate, the sort who still learned the names of every member of his household staff within a week of hiring them. Tonight, in a charcoal tuxedo, watching his bride move toward him beneath the restored glass ceiling, even Nathaniel looked like a man who believed he had everything exactly as it should be. Her name was Camille Sinclair, 30 years old, radiant, ambitious, raised in a family whose old money had grown considerably thinner than its public reputation suggested, a detail only a small circle of people fully understood. Camille had spent nearly 2 years orchestrating every detail of this wedding with the precision of someone building a case, rather than planning a celebration. Every floral arrangement, every seating assignment, every camera angle had been considered and reconsidered until it was, in her own words to the event planner, absolutely flawless. Which is exactly why, when a crystal champagne flute slipped from a passing tray and shattered near the hem of her gown, something in her reacted with a speed and violence that startled everyone standing close enough to see it happen. The woman holding that tray was 28 years old. Her name, according to the small brass tag pinned to her uniform, was Marisol Vance, and she had been part of the estate's event staff for exactly 9 days. She wore the standard uniform, black dress, white apron, dark hair pinned back neatly, and she moved through the reception with the particular quiet efficiency that made good event staff invisible in exactly the way their employers wanted them to be. She apologized instantly, dropping to her knees to gather the broken glass, her voice low and steady despite the sudden, sharp attention now aimed at her from every nearby table. "I'm so sorry. I'll have this cleared right away." Camille wasn't looking at the glass. She was looking at the guest turning toward the commotion, at the photographer already lifting his camera. At the exact moment 3 separate phones had begun recording. Something ugly and immediate surged up in her. The same old fear she'd carried since childhood, that any visible flaw, any crack in the performance, would reveal exactly how carefully the whole thing had been constructed to hide what her family actually was. "Do you have any idea," Camille said, her voice cutting cleanly through the orchestra, "what this dress cost? What tonight cost?" "I understand, ma'am. I'm very sorry. Sorry isn't nearly enough." And then, in front of 300 guests, in front of a groom standing only 10 feet away, in front of cameras that would within hours find their way onto more phones than anyone in that room could have predicted, Camille raised her hand and struck Marisol across the face. The sound cracked through the ballroom louder than the music. For one full, suspended second, nobody breathed. Marisol's head turned slightly with the force of it, a faint red mark blooming instantly across her cheek. She didn't cry out. She didn't lift a hand to her face. She simply knelt there, absolutely still, staring at the broken glass scattered across the marble floor, while 300 of the wealthiest people on the eastern seaboard watched in silence and did nothing at all. Nathaniel, standing close enough to have seen every second of it, felt something cold drop through his chest. He opened his mouth to intervene, but before he could form a single word, Marisol rose slowly to her feet, gathered the shards of glass onto her tray with steady, unhurried hands, and walked calmly toward the kitchen without a single word of protest. She didn't run. She didn't sob. She simply left with a composure that somehow made the silence in that ballroom heavier than any outburst could have. Camille, aware suddenly that every eye in the room had settled on her, forced a light laugh and waved a dismissive hand. "Staff these days," she said, and the orchestra almost mercifully resumed. Conversation slowly restarted. Champagne glasses clinked again. The party moved forward the way parties always seem to, regardless of what's just happened inside them. Nathaniel could not move forward with it. He kept glancing toward the kitchen doors, an unease building in his chest he couldn't fully name. Something about the way that woman had walked away, calm, dignified, almost as though this particular kind of humiliation wasn't entirely unfamiliar to her, unsettled him in a way he didn't understand until much later. He excused himself 20 minutes afterward, telling Camille he needed to check on catering logistics. When he reached the kitchen, Marisol was gone. Her apron sat folded neatly on the counter beside a name tag, and in the staffing office nearby, her file already carried a single notation. Position concluded. She had left the estate without a trace. Nathaniel had no way of knowing, standing there staring at that folded apron, that he had just witnessed something considerably larger than a wedding mishap, or that within 3 weeks, everything he believed about the woman he was about to marry would come apart entirely. 3 weeks passed, and life at Ashgrove settled back into its usual rhythm of thank you notes, honeymoon planning, and the slow unwinding of wedding logistics. But Nathaniel couldn't shake the memory of that ballroom. He found himself thinking about it during board meetings, during quiet dinners, at odd hours when the house had gone still around him. It wasn't guilt exactly, though guilt was certainly part of it. It was something closer to the persistent, nagging sense that he had witnessed a piece of information he wasn't yet allowed to understand. Nathaniel had grown up wealthy, but not entirely comfortable inside that wealth. His grandmother, Beatrice Voss, the family's formidable 91-year-old matriarch, who still technically controlled the family's largest trust, had a saying she'd repeated to him since childhood. Money reveals character, Nathaniel. It doesn't build it. Watch closely how someone treats a person who can do absolutely nothing for them. That, and only that, is who they actually are. He tried, carefully, to raise the incident with Camille over dinner one evening. "The woman at the wedding," he began. "The one who dropped the glass. Have you thought about her at all since?" Camille barely glanced up from her phone. "Why would I think about a maid, Nathaniel? I'm sure she found something else. People like that always land somewhere. People like that." The phrase settled uncomfortably in his chest and stayed there for days. What Nathaniel didn't yet know was that his own grandmother had been watching this entire situation unfold with a great deal more knowledge than she'd let on. Beatrice Voss lived in a smaller cottage on the estate grounds, retired officially from the company's daily operations, but retaining, through a carefully structured family trust, final authority over the disposition of Voss Maritime's controlling shares once she passed. It was a fact most of the extended family understood only vaguely, assuming the paperwork was largely ceremonial. It was not ceremonial. And Beatrice had a tradition, one she had quietly maintained for over 3 decades, that almost no one in the family fully understood the scope of. Before any significant transfer of family authority, whether a marriage into the family, a promotion into senior leadership, or a change in trust beneficiaries, Beatrice arranged, discreetly and through channels entirely separate from the family's usual staffing agencies, for a trained, credentialed observer to work anonymously within the household for a short period, evaluating exactly the kind of character her own late husband had once taught her mattered more than any balance sheet. How does this person treat someone who can offer them absolutely nothing? Marisol Vance was not, in fact, simply an event server working temporary shifts to cover rent. Marisol held a graduate degree in structural engineering and historic preservation from Cornell, and had spent the past 6 years building a respected career restoring and redesigning historic coastal properties across New England, work that had, in fact, included the delicate structural renovation of Ashgrove's own conservatory ceiling 18 months earlier, a project she had led personally, though her firm's name, not her own, had appeared on the public paperwork. Beatrice had hired her specifically for the wedding, not through the estate's event staffing company, but through a private arrangement neither Nathaniel nor Camille had any knowledge of, precisely because Beatrice wanted an unbiased, professional set of eyes inside that ballroom, evaluating the woman about to marry into control of a fortune Beatrice had spent 70 years building. She had not anticipated the slap. She had, however, anticipated learning something true. Marisol had taken the assignment reluctantly at first. Beatrice's foundation, which quietly funded exactly this kind of discreet character assessment work for several prominent families across New England, paid generously and had, over the years, become an unusual but genuinely respected sideline for professionals willing to do it. Engineers, therapists, former hospitality executives, people whose actual expertise made them unusually perceptive observers of exactly the kind of behavior that mattered. She had never expected to be struck across the face in front of 300 strangers. Sitting in her own apartment 3 weeks later, an ice pack long since discarded, but the memory of that moment still sharp, Marisol reviewed her final written assessment for Beatrice one more time before submitting it, the same steady, professional prose she used in every structural inspection report she'd ever filed. Except this time the subject wasn't a failing support beam. It was a woman who had, in a single unguarded moment, revealed exactly the character Beatrice had asked her to look for. She hadn't told Beatrice about the slap immediately. It had taken her nearly a week to fully process what had happened, and a strange, complicated part of her still felt embarrassed by it, as though absorbing the humiliation publicly had been some failure of her own composure rather than an act of simple professional restraint. When she finally called Beatrice to deliver her assessment in full, the older woman was silent on the line for a long moment. "She struck you," Beatrice said finally, her voice carrying a controlled fury Marisol had never heard from her employer before. "In front of my grandson. In front of everyone. Yes. And you said nothing. You didn't identify yourself. You simply left. That was the assignment," Marisol said carefully. "Observe. Don't intervene. Don't reveal the arrangement unless you instructed me to." "I did not," Beatrice said. "Anticipate needing to give you that instruction under these particular circumstances." A long pause. "I am so sorry, Marisol. Genuinely. This was never meant to cost you anything at all." Nathaniel learned the full truth not from his grandmother directly, but through his own growing suspicion, which finally drove him, nearly 2 weeks after the wedding, to ask Beatrice outright why an event server he'd never seen before or since had unsettled him so deeply. He found his grandmother in her cottage study, the late afternoon light slanting across a desk covered in the kind of paperwork Nathaniel had always assumed was purely ceremonial. She looked at him for a long moment before setting down her pen. "Sit down, Nathaniel. I think it's time I told you something I probably should have told you years ago." She explained the tradition carefully, methodically, the decades of quiet character assessments conducted before every major transition of family authority, the arrangement with Marisol's small circle of professional colleagues, and finally, gently, the fact that the woman Camille had struck in front of 300 guests was not simply temporary event staff, but a credentialed structural engineer who had, 18 months earlier, personally overseen the delicate restoration of the very conservatory ceiling his wedding had taken place beneath. Nathaniel sat in stunned silence for nearly a full minute before he could speak. "You were testing Camille." "I was testing the character of the woman about to inherit significant influence over this family's future," Beatrice said evenly. "I have done this before every major transition in this family for over 30 years, Nathaniel. Your own father was evaluated the same way before he married your mother. He passed. 2 of your cousin's spouses did not, and I made certain, quietly, that the trust structures reflected that. And Camille failed. Camille struck a kneeling woman across the face in front of 300 witnesses over a broken glass," Beatrice said, her voice hardening. "She did not fail a test, Nathaniel. She revealed, without any prompting or pressure from me, exactly who she is when she believes there will be no consequence for it." The confrontation with Camille happened the following morning, in the same sunroom where Nathaniel had once nervously proposed the investigator's findings, though there had been no investigator at all, simply his grandmother's carefully documented decades-long practice spread across the glass table between them. "Her name is Marisol Vance," Nathaniel said, his voice carrying a controlled anger Camille had never once heard from him in 3 years together. "She's a structural engineer. She restored the conservatory ceiling we got married under. My grandmother hired her to observe the wedding, and you slapped her in front of everyone over a broken glass. Camille's face drained of color, but only briefly. She straightened her shoulders with practiced speed. Nathaniel, I didn't know who she was. How could I possibly have known that? It was an emotional night. I was stressed. Everyone was watching. That's exactly the problem, Nathaniel said quietly. Everyone was watching, and you still chose to strike a woman on her knees, apologizing to you for something that wasn't even her fault. You didn't need to know her name or her degree to know that was wrong, Camille. You needed only to be a decent person in a moment nobody had prepared you to perform for. Camille's eyes hardened into something considerably colder. So, what, you're going to throw away everything we've built over some maid? The word maid, delivered with such casual contempt, landed on Nathaniel like a second slap entirely his own to absorb. He looked at the woman he had planned to spend the rest of his life with, and for the first time in 3 years, he saw her with total, unclouded clarity, not through the comfortable fog of routine and family expectation, but exactly as she was. Someone who valued the performance of grace considerably more than the substance of it. I need some time, he said quietly, and walked out, leaving Camille alone in the sunroom with the weight of her own silence. Finding Marisol again took Nathaniel the better part of a week. Working carefully through the small professional network Beatrice provided, rather than pursuing anything that might feel, to Marisol, like being tracked down after an already humiliating public ordeal. When he finally located her firm's small office overlooking the harbor, he sat outside for nearly 20 minutes before working up the resolve to go in, terrified of exactly how she might react to seeing him again. Marisol's first instinct, seeing Nathaniel Voss standing in her office doorway, was something close to dread. Whatever this is, she said carefully, I don't need it. I did the work I was hired to do. Whatever happens between you and Camille isn't something I need to be part of. Please, Nathaniel said. 5 minutes. That's genuinely all I'm asking. Something in his voice, unpolished, uncertain, nothing like the composed air the society pages like to describe, made her pause. She gestured him toward the chair across from her desk. For the first time since that night, Nathaniel apologized properly, not for his grandmother's arrangement, which he made clear he'd only just learned of himself, but for the fact that he had stood 10 feet away and allowed a woman to be struck in front of him without moving fast enough to stop it. I froze, he admitted. I've replayed that moment probably 200 times since. I keep trying to understand why I didn't just step in immediately. And the honest answer is that I've spent my whole life in rooms where nobody expects me to intervene in anything, because someone else always handles it. That's not an excuse. I understand that. I just want you to know I've actually sat with it. Marisol studied him for a long moment. You froze for about 4 seconds, she said finally. I've had considerably worse happen to me in restaurant kitchens for a lot less reason. I appreciate the apology, genuinely. But I don't need you carrying guilt over 4 seconds of hesitation, Nathaniel. I need you to understand what actually mattered that night, which had nothing to do with you at all. She told him, carefully and without much emotional weight attached to it, about the work she actually did, the restoration projects across the New England coast, the particular satisfaction of taking a structure everyone assumed was beyond saving and finding, through careful, patient work, exactly what could still be preserved. I do this kind of assessment work for your grandmother's foundation, maybe twice a year, she said. It pays well, and honestly, it's fascinating. You learn more about a person's actual character in one unguarded evening than you'd learn in a year of polite dinner conversation. Most of the time, nothing dramatic happens at all. People are generally decent, even when they think no one important is watching. And Camille wasn't. Camille wasn't, Marisol confirmed. That's rare in my experience. Most people manage at least basic decency towards service staff, even when they're stressed. What she did wasn't stress. It was a very specific kind of fear. The fear of losing control of an image she'd spent enormous effort constructing. I've seen it before. It's not really about the person being struck at all. It's about what the striker is terrified other people will see if they don't immediately reassert control. Nathaniel absorbed this in silence for a long moment. My grandmother wants to fund the restoration work properly, formally, not as some quiet arrangement buried in a foundation's discretionary budget. She wants to establish a proper historic preservation initiative through Voss Maritime, and she wants you to lead the design work. I don't need charity, Nathaniel. What happened to me doesn't need to be repaid with a job offer. It's not charity, Nathaniel said. You're genuinely the best in the region at this kind of work. My grandmother has been saying so for 18 months, since before any of this happened. This isn't guilt money. It's simply, finally, giving credit to work that's already excellent, work that's been quietly happening under someone else's name on the paperwork for years. What followed over the next several months unfolded with a considerably more public reckoning than either of them initially expected. Word of the broken engagement moved quickly through Newport social circles, but it was the announcement 3 weeks later that truly shifted the story's shape entirely. Beatrice Voss, at 91, held a small but carefully attended gathering at Ash Grove. No orchestra, no 500 guests, just family, senior company leadership, and a handful of respected journalists who covered New England's business and preservation communities with genuine care rather than sensationalism. She spoke plainly about the family's long-standing evaluation tradition, a practice she'd kept private for 30 years but had decided, given recent events, deserved to be acknowledged rather than quietly buried the way it always had been before. For 3 decades, Beatrice told the gathered crowd, I have made certain that anyone marrying significant authority into this family was observed, honestly, and without their knowledge, treating someone who could offer them nothing at all. I make no apology for that practice. What I do apologize for, publicly and completely, is that the woman I hired to conduct that observation this time was struck across the face in the process, and I did not act quickly enough afterward to properly correct that harm. She turned to where Marisol stood, deliberately, at the front of the gathering rather than at its edges. Marisol Vance is one of the finest structural engineers and historic preservationists working on this coastline today. She restored the very ceiling above the room where my grandson was married. Effective today, she will lead Voss Maritime's newly established Coastal Heritage Preservation Initiative, a program that will properly credit and fund exactly the kind of careful, unglamorous restoration work that too often disappears beneath someone else's name on a permit application. The story, once it reached wider coverage, resonated with a public that had, by then, already seen the earlier viral footage of the slap circulating with cruel commentary attached. What had once been dismissed by strangers online as staff drama took on an entirely different weight once the full context finally emerged. A woman with genuine professional standing, absorbing public humiliation with quiet composure, not because she lacked options, but because the assignment had asked her to. Camille Sinclair largely disappeared from Newport social circles in the months that followed. The broken engagement combined with the recontextualized footage made her, fairly or not, a symbol of exactly the kind of casual cruelty towards service workers that a great many people watching from home recognized uncomfortably from their own lives, if not as the perpetrator, then as a witness who had also once stayed silent. Nathaniel, for his part, spent those same months slowly rebuilding not just a working relationship with Marisol, but his own understanding of the world his family's wealth had quietly been built on top of for generations. He learned to sit in meetings and simply listen rather than direct. He worked alongside Marisol on the Preservation Initiative's earliest projects, learning, slowly, the specific patience required to save something worth saving rather than simply replace it. Nothing about what grew between them was rushed or dramatic. It was slow, careful, built on considerably more mutual respect than either of them had expected to find, first as colleagues, then, gradually, as something neither of them had planned, but both, eventually, chose without hesitation. 1 year after that wedding, on the anniversary of the Coastal Heritage Preservation Initiative's first completed restoration, a modest lighthouse keeper's cottage on the northern point of the estate, Nathaniel stood at a small gathering overlooking the water. No orchestra, no 500 guests in designer gowns, just family, colleagues, and a handful of the tradespeople who'd worked alongside Marisol on the restoration itself. A year ago, Nathaniel said, his voice steady but full of something considerably more genuine than the polished toast he'd once been trained to give at events like this. I watched a woman get struck in front of 300 people, and I froze for 4 seconds before I understood what I was actually watching. I've spent this past year trying to understand what those 4 seconds revealed about the world I grew up believing was simply how things worked. He turned toward Marisol, standing quietly at the edge of the small crowd in work boots rather than heels, exactly as comfortable here as she'd been composed that night. What I've learned, he continued, is that the people who quietly hold the world together, who restore what everyone else has written off, who absorb what shouldn't have to be absorbed with more grace than anyone has any right to expect, they're never actually invisible. We just haven't trained ourselves to look. If there's one thing tonight's story should leave you with, it's this. Character isn't revealed in how someone treats people who can benefit them. It's revealed entirely in the moments they believe no consequence will ever follow them home. Marisol Vance could have let that humiliation define her, could have exposed the entire arrangement the moment she recognized what was happening, could have let her own justified anger take the microphone that night in front of 300 strangers. Instead, she chose quiet, professional composure, and in doing so revealed considerably more strength in silence than an entire ballroom managed with their voices. And Beatrice Voss, at 91 years old, chose to finally give credit publicly to a practice and a person she had spent decades keeping carefully out of sight, because sometimes doing the right thing late is still considerably better than never doing it at all. Be kind to the people the world has quietly trained you to overlook. You genuinely never know whose careful, unglamorous work is holding up the very room you're standing in. If tonight's story moved you, hit that like button. Subscribe if you're new here, because we tell stories exactly like this one every single week, and share it with someone who needs the reminder that dignity, quietly held, is never actually invisible, even when an entire room chooses to look away. Thank you for staying with me until the end tonight. I'll see you in the next one.